said at the very beginning, this is the season, Merry Christmas season. The word Christmas came from the Catholic tradition of Christ Mass. It's the celebration of the Christ. We all know the Christmas story. It's probably the most told story ever, right? We still see nativity scenes everywhere. This story of way over 2,000 years has been retold and told and put in so many different paintings and whatnot. And as I was preparing for this, I remembered what this story was about. And this story was the promise of this: peace on earth and goodwill to all. That was the essence, that was the purpose of this story. And you know, I'm always asking why and how, and so I asked, why has it not happened? It's over 2,000 years old, this story. Told over and over again, repeated every year at Christmas. Where is peace on earth and goodwill to all? What happened? Why hasn't it happened? And so in looking at this week, I had to ask that question over and over again of myself, and I'm going to ask it for you. You know the story. You can tell the story. You don't need me to tell it, right? So version 1, I called the literal, historical, physical version. Kind of like versions of software memory. This is the one told, first written about 50, 60 years after Jesus' death, when we figure, the Bible scholars say, when Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote this story. And we know the whole story, right? We know baby Jesus was in the manger, there was a king. Why didn't it bring peace on earth and goodwill to all? When we looked at all of this, we had the cattle, we had the shepherds on. By the way, anyone who's been to Israel, I don't think the shepherds were on the hills in December. Just saying. It's real cold. So the story, if it did happen literally, it probably happened historically, happened probably in July or August. But there's a whole reason why it got moved. Christmas got moved to December 25th, and I don't think it had anything to do with this birth of the baby Jesus. But we had wise men coming from afar and the most expensive gifts, and we had a star that led them, and then this king that tried to kill all the babies. I mean, this is an incredible story, is it not? It's a beautiful story. And we still celebrate it today, 2,000 years later. But we don't stop sometimes and ask the question that I'm asking today. What happened to peace on earth and goodwill to all? Why isn't it happening? I think all of you probably know in your own mind. You have ideas, why not? I can only share with you what mine are. But we're talking centuries, 21 of them actually, and no peace on earth and no goodwill to all. Version 2.0 came about 150 some years ago. We called it New Thought. It was unity. It was science of the mind and divine science. And this version did some incredible things for us. And number one thing it began to do was recognize that all of those characters in the story we just talked about were not 2,000 years ago. They were representative of what's happening within your consciousness and within mine. We began to look at the characters and the names and the places and look at how that could help us understand what was going on within us. We called it metaphysics, right? Beyond the physical. So the first story was physical, no doubt. And as we transition into version 2.0, in the metaphysics about 150 years ago, I'll say it started. And we began to understand some of these things as what was going on within our own consciousness. Because as part of the metaphysics movement, we began to understand that consciousness was the one thing that was eternal. And it was the one thing that our lives manifested from. What showed up in our affairs were showing up because what was happening within our own consciousness. Sometimes we don't stop and answer the question, what is consciousness? What does that mean for you? Now you're all sitting in a New Thought church and have no idea what consciousness is. You're looking at me like I have 3 heads up here. What's consciousness to you? What does it mean? Higher self? Folks, we got to answer this for ourselves before we go on. Now, there's many different definitions you can use. The one that I like, it's the sum total of everything that you think, everything that you feel, everything that you believe, your attitudes. It's what you're conscious of is your consciousness, right? Does that make sense? Are you conscious in this moment sitting here that you're alive? Hello? Yes. Some are shaking their head no. That's not good. If you're not conscious that you're alive, you've got a problem today. And it goes way beyond the birth of the Christ 2,000 years ago. It's what you're conscious of. You're conscious that you're alive, right? That no one can take from you. Right? So as we began to move into version 2.0, as I said 150 years ago, we began to look at these metaphysical meanings, and we've talked about these before. I've done similar talks like this. But what it did was it brought us to a higher consciousness. We became more aware that this story was happening within us, in our consciousness. That was the number one thing that I think we learned in that shift that happened with New Thought 150 years ago and pertaining to this story, but plus many other things that we talked about. So let's take a quick look. Many people felt that Mary represented divine love, the feminine aspect within you, whether you're a man or a woman. We all have it. Joseph was the aspect of wisdom. And when you bring divine love and divine wisdom together, you have an offspring or a baby or a child. And in this story, the baby Jesus in this story represented the Christ or the I am presence within you and I. So as you can see, version 1 took on a whole new meaning as we went into this metaphysical understanding that the whole story is happening within you and within me. It begins to take on a whole nother meaning. The manger, born in our humanness, our lowly sense consciousness of the 5 senses, appearances of what we see may not be true, but we see it and we feel it from there. That's where this has to be born from. Let's look at a couple other ones. We go down into Egypt. Egypt represents the darkness of our subconscious. It's a place to go and kind of hide away while you're beginning to understand what this whole I am or Christ consciousness within you represents. Cattle often represents human thoughts, shepherds, divine protection. Wise men, according to Charles Fillmore in the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, is wisdom within our consciousness. It shows up. When we begin to bring divine love and divine wisdom together, the Mary and Joseph, the wise men come into our lives and enhance this whole notion of the Christ and the I am within. And the star is intuition. And as we open up to more and more of this within our consciousness, it allows us to open up to intuition, which flows to us from Spirit, from God. So we're not just left with our human mind, our rational intellect, but we begin to get the flow of intuition as it flows from Spirit through us. Took the story to a whole nother level. We began to understand it's within us. That was number one. And what was it within? It was within our consciousness. Charles Fillmore said this: Christmas is about the birth of the Christ consciousness at the center of our soul. Pretty good definition for Christmas. Decades, 150 years, 15 decades, no peace on earth, and no goodwill to all. Well, you say, well, a little bit better. Okay, I'll give you that. But if you look at where we are today versus 150 years ago, there's some people who would say it's not better in many ways. Why not? Why not, when we took this story from version 1 to version 2, why did peace not start to show up in the world? Or how about within each of us individually? I mean, if you look at the statistics today in the United States of the amount of drugs being sold for those who have no peace or little peace, it's like this. Why didn't version 1 and why didn't version 2 work? So the version 1 was the physical, the more literal. As we moved into version 2, it was much more mental, a mental science. It's called science of the mind. Definitely increased our consciousness, definitely increased our understanding at a higher level. You know, I love that energy vortex. And this helped us move from level 1 to level 2, up the vortex of energy. But the reason and the purpose for this story still hasn't come. Peace on earth, goodwill to all. Why not? In version 2, we still had God and me. 1, 2. We still had Christ consciousness in me. 1, 2. We still had duality. And we're missing a very important principle that the master teacher Jesus taught 2,000 years ago. And duality is not the message that he taught. He taught principle of oneness. And this still kept us in 2. I believe, my personal belief is, that that is the reason why version 1 and version 2 has not brought peace to the earth and goodwill to all. So what is version 3.0? I call it mystical or spiritual part of this story. And it's the understanding of how we can move to oneness. Now, we can't move to oneness in the physical, right? You and I can't be one. We're 2, right? We can be in agreement in mind, but most of the time we're not. You have your mind, I have my mind, and we look and think about things one, two. But as we begin to own version 3.0, which is happening at the grassroots all over this world, is a higher understanding of what the master teacher Jesus taught. So let's look at what Genesis said. You were made in the image of God, the image and likeness of God. Is that true for you? How are you made in the image and likeness of God? In what way? Do you have the body of God? God doesn't have a body, right? So you can't. How about the mind? Is your mind the mind of God? Let's go on and look at what else we're told in John. God is spirit, and those who, and I'm going to put a word in here for worship because that gets a little too religious. I'm going to put a word in experience. For those who want to experience God must experience God in what? Spirit and truth. Not physical, not the mind. This is why I believe that version 1 and version 2 never brought peace on earth and goodwill to all. Because we have to understand what being in the likeness and the image of God, which is spirit and truth, what is that we are created out of? It's consciousness. Its spirit and truth is consciousness. And the only way we can begin to experience God as one. You know, I said this the other night on Tuesday nights. Many times in oneness, we think about oneness being a bottle floating in the ocean. Say we're one with the ocean. No, it's still two. It's the bottle and the ocean. And the same as us, as I went in version 1 and 2, it was God and me. Two. And so the only way that I can see that we go to version 3.0 is we begin to understand that God is divine consciousness and made in the likeness and the image of what? Consciousness. And it's the only way that we can become one. We can't in the body, we can't in the mind. But we can in consciousness. And when we begin to understand that God, the word God we use, and we use many different words here, because whatever word works for you. I like allness, because it encompasses it all. But allness is consciousness. And it's the only way that I can begin to do what the master teacher said, I and the Father are one. And that's what I'm calling the principle of oneness has been missed for 2,000 plus years. And the only way that I can figure out that he became one was through consciousness. And a willingness to be conscious that the consciousness of the Father was his consciousness. Became one, not two. I don't know any other way that it could become true. And as we begin to consciously open up to that and move into this version 3.0, things begin to change completely. So this was in John 10:30. This is the piece that's been missing for so many years. I and my Father are one. The Father was the name. Let's talk about that name for a minute. In the Hebrew Old Testament, it was called Emmanuel, God within. Moses called it what? I am that I am. Same thing. Later on, Jesus called it the Father within. And 90 years after that, when Paul came, Paul said the Christed one, the illuminated one. But this was taught in every religion around the world. Shankara, 800 BC, taught in India the yoga of non-dualism, oneness. 350 years later, Buddha taught the very same thing. So did Lao Tzu in China. All of this happened long before this story happened 2,000 years ago. And every one of the most enlightened, awakened teachers in the history of humans have understood that we have to some point get to version 3.0. That I and my Father are one. Not two. One. So if God's consciousness is my consciousness, I want you to feel that for a minute. How's that feel? If God's consciousness is my consciousness, we become one. The only way that I know you can, or that I can. So Christ consciousness, and we say this every Sunday, do we not? We're here, our vision is to awaken to the Christ consciousness. And to me, that means awakening to the oneness with Christ consciousness. We're missing a word. Otherwise, it's Christ consciousness, Dan consciousness. Two. As we open to this oneness, the teaching of, I call the principle of oneness, as we begin to understand Christ consciousness as my consciousness, consciously aware of that, we begin to move into this state of oneness. And it's only when we become conscious of that does oneness occur. I don't know any other way, and if you have other way, I'd love to talk to you about it. I don't know any other way it can happen unless it's through the consciousness of the divine becoming my consciousness, and we become one. I and the Christ become one. To me, this is the true birth of the Christ. Not the literal historical version, and not the mental one, because we still have duality. But it's in the moving to opening up to the consciousness of the divine, and that I am consciously aware that we are one and the same. I don't know how else I can be made in the likeness and the image of God. I don't know any other way. And when I realize that God consciousness is my consciousness, not two, not separate, one. Christ, or the I am, is still the babe being born in the manger of our human feelings and thoughts. As we awaken to this oneness, you can take the whole story back. And you begin to understand what we learned in version 1, version 2, but learn it from the standpoint of oneness with. Not either or, and. God, consciousness, and my consciousness merge into oneness. Principle of oneness. And finally, peace on earth, goodwill to all. How do I know? Because it happens within you. You individually begin to see and feel your world change. And it's the only way this world will ever change. Individuals getting connected in oneness to the divine, one at a time. As the Master Teacher Jesus said, you and I are the light to the world. I don't know any other way to light it up than this way. Oneness. Finally, peace will come to the earth, which were promised in Revelations that it will, and goodwill to all. Let's go to stillness. On this Christmas, 2019, I invite you to open up to the possibility that you can truly become one with the consciousness of God. doesn't matter if you call it Atman like the Hindus do, or the Tao like the Taoists, or Emmanuel like the Hebrews, or the Father as Jesus, or as Paul said, the Christ. The words don't matter. What matters, and the affirmations and the quotations don't matter. What matters is that you feel it, you realize it, that you can experience it within you. What are you looking to experience? You're looking to experience God consciousness as yours. And as we go into the stillness, because it's the only place that it can happen, it transcends human thought. Open up to the possibility this Christmas to become one.